before he really got a look at what he had something unique. And this is what he had to say about it. I stood in the shade holding the endocast. That's the skull. We'll talk about that in a minute. The endocast brain as greedily as any miser hugs his gold, my mind racing ahead. Here I was, certain as was one of the most significant finds ever made in the history of anthropology. This was before he even studied the fossils. He said this. This was his attitude. He was all excited about the great thing he found. And this is what he had. He opened up one of the crates, and he didn't even find this, but it was delivered to him in the crate that came out of the sediments of one of these caves that had been filled in. The front of a skull, and then an endocast of the brain. And the endocast of the brain is simply the brain was buried, and the rock hardened around it. The brain rotted away. The space was filled with sediments from water around it and filled the space, so you're left with an impression of the brain. So he had the impression of the brain in the skull, or the front of the skull. And it took him a long time to chisel this out of the solid limestone it was in. And so from this, even before he studied it, he was convinced he had a major discovery. And dated this thing as being between 2 and 3 million years old, which puts it in the Australopithecus africanus category, something that's 2 to 3 million years old. Now, the problem with this skull is that in 1973, after this thing had been pretty much universally accepted as a monkeys to man piece of evidence for hominid to man evolution and all that, South African geologist T.C. Partridge revealed that the cave that this thing was excavated from could not have formed more than 870,000 years ago. So this 2 to 3 million year old fossil somehow ended up in a cave that was 870,000 years old. It really ruined the dating process on this skull, because the claim was, because of where it came from in the sediments, that it had to be 2 to 3 million years old. And the features fit something that they think they would like to have as being 2 or 3 million years old. But the cave it came out of was only 870,000 years old. Partridge had used something they call thermoluminescence dating and some uranium series dating, which the books I read didn't elaborate on, but I think it's probably uranium-lead dating on some materials in the sediment. To date this thing at between 942,000 years old and 742,000 years old. So this created problems for the dating of a skull that they claim was otherwise 2 to 3 million years old. How could you have Australopithecus africanus that came out of a source spot that was 870,000 years old? According to an evolutionist, T.C. Partridge is an evolutionist. How could that be?
It was a cache by prehistoric archaeologists. Stored all their fossils there.
That's possible. Well, Dart was long dead, and Philip Tobias took Dart's place as the chief professor of anthropology at that same university that Dart worked at. And this is what Philip Tobias had to say when the T.C. Partridge controversy came about. Although nearly 50 years have elapsed since its discovery, it is true to say that the Tong skull has never been fully analyzed and described. 50 years later, it's never been fully analyzed and described. So neither Dart nor Tobias, who is now the custodian of the skull, did a thorough study of this thing to find out anything about it. Dart's initial enthusiasm dated it. He knew what he had even before he studied it. 50 years later, it still hadn't been studied. How can you do something like that? I mean, is that science? Let's make all kinds of claims without really studying it out? Roger Lewin, quoting Donald Johanson in Lubinau's book on Bones of Contention, only those in the inner circle get to see the fossils. Only those who agree with a particular interpretation of a particular investigator are allowed to see the fossils. So how can we have a science that's self-correcting if you can't see the real fossils? Piltdown Man would have been discovered as a fraud a lot earlier if students were working off the actual fossils and not casts of the actual fossils. Oh, I should add, Australopithecus afarensis, I'm going to read this. 1974, Johansen discovered Lucy, and this Tong skull faded away, and the controversy about the dating in the cave. Australopithecus afarensis replaced Australopithecus africanus as our direct human ancestor. Now Australopithecus africanus is being moved back into the family tree, and the Partridge date is being ignored, even though he used a process called thermoluminescence to date the cave. And I should add that when you can't use radiocarbon dating, which you use on organic material, you want to date pottery remains and that type of stuff that you find in sediments, it is a standard practice to use thermoluminescence to date the sediments, to date the pottery. And it's accepted. It's considered legitimate. But in the case of this skull, because the date is 2 to 3 million years old, that's what they want to apply to the skull. And Partridge's date, using this accepted method of dating, is outside the range of the 2 to 3 million years old. The date is disparaged, and so is Partridge for the work that he did. Okay, just a couple more fossils to go and we're going to be done. Canopoi elbow, KP271. I like this one because this shows more the way preconceived ideas dictate what they find. KP271 is what they call the distal end of the humerus, the lower half. Okay, that was all they found. The lower half of a humerus, a humerus. And based on the humerus, they decided that this sucker, it's 4.5 million years old. This predates Australopithecus afarensis. Makes it one of the oldest hominid fossils ever found. So they wanted to get an idea of exactly the nature of this thing, so they did computer analysis of the shape and size of this KP271 lower end humerus fossil, and they took a chimp, Australopithecus africanus, and modern humans, and they took 4 measures from 7 different samples, ran a computer analysis to see what KP271 was closest to. Was it the chimp, was it africanus, or modern human? And guess what it came out to be? Published in April 7th, 1967, KP271, 4.5 million year old fossil, was found to be strikingly close to the human sample. And then they concluded, but this fossil will probably prove to be Australopithecus africanus, which would be 2 million years old. And why did they say that? Even though the computer analysis showed it was much closer to modern humans than to Australopithecus africanus. And did you know they don't actually have any lower ends of the humerus of an Australopithecus africanus to compare it to? But they do have the